Welcome to the Naad series of lectures on basics of biology, and this is lecture 8, which is on symmetry in biology. So, what is the importance of symmetry and why do we need to study it? Shape and geometry are some fundamental aspects of any biological organism. Symmetry in an organism refers to the arrangement of body structures relative to the axis of the body. Symmetrical organisms are those that can be split along at least one plane, resulting in two halves similar to each other. And asymmetrical organisms are those that do not have a body axis, and also there is no plane of symmetry. So the above two diagrams are, on the left there are sponges, on the right there are amoeba. So if you draw a line anywhere across these organisms, you cannot divide the organism into two similar looking parts. That is what you call as asymmetrical. Now we will talk about the various types of symmetrical or various types of symmetries that are found in organisms. The first one is spherical symmetry. So these organisms have a spherical shape and they do lack a general body axis. So there is not one axis that is going through their body. Because they are spherical, they can be multiple axes, and the body parts are arranged concentrically around a central point. So rather than an axis, there is a central point, and from that central point, all the body parts are arranged outwards in the form of a sphere. The body can be divided into two halves through an infinite number of planes passing through the center. So any plane that passes through the center point of these spherical organisms can divide the organism into two equal halves. Spherical symmetry is found only in some protists, so it's not very common in nature, but some protists do have spherical symmetry. And asymmetrical and spherically symmetrical organisms are the two types of symmetry where the body axis, a defined body axis, is lacking. So there is no body axis in two cases: when a sort of organism is asymmetrical or when it is spherically symmetrical. Next, we talk about the radial symmetry. The body has a general, in radial symmetry, the body is generally in the form of a cylinder, like you can see in the right. These sort of organisms, they have various body parts that are arranged around the axis of the cylinder. So there's an opening on top and let's say an exit from the bottom, and around that cylindrical structure, everything is, or the axis of that cylinder, every organ is arranged. Any plane that is passing through the axis results in equal halves, which can be further cut into quarters. So you can cut, as you can see in the diagram, you can take a plane and cut the organism into two equal halves by passing that plane through the axis, and you can do it in various ways. And next is that these organisms do not have a front or a back end. They have an opening, I should say two openings, like top or bottom or somewhere, but there's not a front or a back or like an anterior or posterior end to it, to these organisms. When a gut is present, the axis passes through the mouth feeding oral surface to opposite aboral surface, meaning that generally the axis that we are talking about in the cylindrical structure goes through the gut, which is the gut, which is basically the digestive system, which has an opening in the form of a mouth and an exit in form of some aboral exit, sort of anus. There can be various types of radial symmetries or modifications. In case of a perfect radial symmetry, the body parts are arranged at equal intervals around the axis, such as feeding tentacles and sensory receptors that you can see in these diagrams, that somewhere the tentacles are very similar and they are arranged at equal spacing from the central place. And this sort of radial symmetry or perfect radial symmetry is found in some sponges and some cnidaria polyps. Now let's talk about some other forms of radial symmetry. Organisms can have radial symmetry, but in some cases it can happen that there are only two planes in that cylindrical like structure through which they can be cut into equal halves. So if two such planes are present, it is known as biradial symmetry. If four such planes can be identified, it is known as quadriradial symmetry. And if five such planes are identified, then it is, as in the case of starfish, it can be pentaradial symmetry. And one interesting thing in the case of starfish is that it has a characteristic pentaradial symmetry, but the functionally or the inside, like anatomically, they are radially symmetrical, perfectly radially symmetrical, although from outside they are pentaradially symmetrical. Now let's talk about bilateral symmetry. The axis passes from the front anterior end to the rear posterior end, and a single plane is capable of dividing the body into the equal left and right halves. It is called as mid-sagittal plane. So you can see in the above diagram the mid-sagittal plane, which passes from the anterior to the posterior end, and it divides the organism into left and right halves. A longitudinal plane passing perpendicular to the mid-sagittal can separate the upper and the lower ventral halves. So again in the above diagram, frontal plane you can see divides the organism into upper and lower half, although the upper and lower half might not divide the organism into equal halves. The transverse plane is any plane that cuts across the body perpendicular to the main body axis, and generally transverse sections are cut to be studied in case of experiments, and generally transverse sections are studied. And then bilateral symmetry is generally found in animals with highly directional mobility. Most of the higher organisms have a bilateral symmetry, and it is also characterized by the presence of a specialized head, which also contains all the nervous tissues. The other thing is that the surfaces of the animal differentiate as dorsal and ventral regions, the latter becoming locomotory and the former being specialized for protection. So the dorsal region mostly of the organisms with bilateral symmetry, the dorsal region generally protects or forms a protective um, portion of the body, and the ventral develops limbs from which is used for locomotion in such organisms. So with this we come to an end to this topic of symmetries in biological organisms. If you have any recommendations or questions, or you want some notes, you can put it in the comment section. And if you like the channel, please subscribe it and share it with your friends. Thank you, and see you next time.